I'm T.K. Daniel, Chair of the Steering Committee of the Emeritus Academy, and welcome to the December 2002 edition of the Academy Lectures. We're going to start off the meeting today by introducing the new members of the Academy. And I'm going to name them and give their affiliations. Tony Buffington of the Department of Veterinary Clinical Sciences. Tony, where are you? There you go. Welcome, Tony. Charles Emery from the Department of Psychology. Charles? Charles. Welcome, Charles. Jonathan Finley of the Department of Pediatrics and Harvey Graff of the Department of English will not be with us today for various reasons. Kate Hubner of the Department of Cancer Biology and Genetics.
Yes, I'm here. Hello.
Welcome, Kate. Brian McHale, the Department of English. Brian. Welcome, Brian. Fred Miser of the Department of Family and Community Medicine. Welcome. Hi. Christine Ballingy Morris of the Department of Arts Administration, Education, and Policy.
Hey there.
Welcome, Christine.
Thank you.
And George Newell of the Department of Teaching and Learning. Greetings, George. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to the Emeritus Academy.
Thank you.
Our presentation today is from Professor Bruce Kimball. His presentation is entitled Wealth, Cost, and Price in American Higher Education, 1970s to the 1920s. Professor Kimball is Professor Emeritus in the Department of Educational Studies, and he has taught at Harvard College, Yale College, the University of Houston, and the University of Rochester, before joining the program of Philosophy and History at Ohio State in 2007. He has written extensively on the history of the liberal arts and professional education, and is focused on the history of higher education finances over the last decade. His books and articles have received awards from the Association of American Colleges and Universities, the National Education Association, the American Society of Legal History, the American Educational Research Association, and the Association for Research on Nonprofit and Voluntary Associations. In 1998, Professor Kimball was awarded a senior fellowship from the American Council of Learned Societies and a 2012 Guggenheim Fellowship. In 2019, he joined the Emeritus Academy of the Ohio State University. I would ask us to hold our questions for Dr. Kimball until after his presentation. Dr. Kimball, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Daniel. I appreciate that introduction. Higher education has historically enjoyed great public esteem in the United States. But over the last 4 decades, that opinion has shifted to resentment, due in large part to the seeming paradox that tuition and student debt have risen rapidly, while fundraising never stops and endowments grow ever larger, particularly at the wealthiest colleges and universities. In the next 45 minutes, I will explain the genesis of that paradox while drawing on the book that I have co-authored with Sarah Iler, who earned her Ph.D. with me at Ohio State. We focus on the nonprofit sector of American higher education, which now includes about 3,300 colleges and universities. To understand this complicated history, it is important to clarify our definitions of key terms at the outset. Wealth, as we use it, denotes the permanent invested capital or endowment of colleges and universities. Cost means the expense that schools pay to produce their education, which is often called production cost. Price denotes the tuition and academic fees charged to or paid by students for their education at colleges and universities. While adopting those key terms, our book divides the historical arc of 150 years into two broad periods, the formative era and the golden ages. The formative era covers the decades from 1870 to 1930 and is defined by the introduction of now familiar kinds of institutions, including research universities, land-grant universities, HBCUs, women's colleges, graduate schools, and junior colleges. The formative era is also defined by the invention of new modes of fundraising. Finally, it was in the formative era that leaders of major universities began to conceive their pursuit of academic excellence and reputation as a Darwinian competition to survive and succeed, as University of Chicago President William Harper and many others stated. Following the interim decades of the 1930s and 1940s, the era of golden ages covers the period from 1950 to the present, and is defined by the advent of aggressive investment strategies for endowment portfolios, along with the infusion of large federal grants and contracts. Also by the increasing concern and complaint about the growing production cost, then the rising price and debt of students, and finally the widening wealth stratification in higher education. Within that chronological framework, I have organized this lecture by three successive topics. First, wealth and revenue. Next, production cost. Third, price and student debt. Turning first to wealth and revenue in the formative era, I begin with the emergence of endowment. Today, the term endowment conventionally denotes funds that are held permanently and invested to produce a perpetual source of income. Consequently, this invested capital was usually called permanent funds or productive funds through the 1910s, because permanence and productivity are its primary attributes. Only in the 1920s did consensus emerge on naming this invested capital endowment. Due to those attributes, endowment is a great benefit to a college or university and is considered an important measure of academic quality, as shown by the endless ranked lists of endowments that we see in the popular press. In 1970, the Chronicle of Higher Education inaugurated these competitive lists more than 50 years ago. All of these well-known aspects of endowment today arose in the formative era between 1870 and 1930. The increasing size of endowment was fueled by the tremendous growth in the nation's economy, starting in the 1870s. In that growing economy, entrepreneurs and industrialists amassed enormous wealth, and many, such as Ezra Cornell, Johns Hopkins, and Leland Stanford, founded or endowed certain colleges and universities with large amounts of invested capital. Here's President Harper, relishing the philanthropy that John D. Rockefeller bestowed on the University of Chicago, his favorite. Drawing on such gifts, 9 private universities accumulated the largest amounts of invested capital and composed the first tier of institutional wealth during the formative era. Large endowment increased the autonomy of these colleges and universities because other kinds of revenue, tuition, gifts, grants, contracts, and government appropriations are unreliable and depend on outsiders' decisions. As the consensus on meaning and terminology emerged, the amount of endowment funds continued to grow. This slide shows the second tier of largest endowments that emerged by 1930. These top two tiers comprise the wealthiest 3% of degree-granting colleges and universities at that time, and almost all remain in the top 3% today. These schools achieved certain advantages in the competition for wealth that ensured their position, as I will discuss shortly. Returning to the first tier, the largest endowment of the decennial year is shaded in this slide. Note that it was only in 1920 that Harvard attained the lead that has continued through today, a century later. Furthermore, each of the other 8 universities in this first tier received a major gift from a benefactor that was several times larger than Harvard's biggest gift. Without receiving such a major gift, Harvard's endowment attained a lead by 1920 that it has never relinquished. How is that possible? Rather than banking enormous gifts, Harvard built its wealth prior to 1930 by adhering to a new coherent strategy of financial management. This strategy was formulated by Harvard President Charles Eliot over the 40 years of his administration from 1869 to 1909. In 1906, Eliot summarized his view quintessentially in these words, and we named Eliot's approach his free money strategy, which is the next topic in my discussion of wealth and revenue. This free money strategy eventually became the common sense, the prevailing ideology of how to survive and succeed in the fierce competition among American colleges and universities. Free money strategy comprised several tenets, which Eliot published in his speeches and 39 annual reports. The first and foundational precept held that a university's rank in the competition for academic accomplishment and reputation will be determined primarily by its wealth. Second, Eliot equated the university's wealth with its endowment, or invested capital, not the size of its campus, faculty, library, or budget. The third tenet of Eliot's strategy was that endowment should be free or unrestricted in purpose. Fourth, Eliot maintained that a university should spend all of its income and run a deficit every year. Any surplus could be deposited in the endowment in order to create the deficit. Eliot's reason was that a university's deficit demonstrated its need for more revenue and endowment. An important corollary is that the university's needs are insatiable. Meanwhile, as Eliot was formulating his free money strategy, a new mode of fundraising was invented. This was the annual alumni appeal that Yale College created in the early 1890s. Over the next 40 years, the alumni fund proliferated in higher education. For example, Virginia State University was the first fully state-supported four-year institution of higher education for African Americans. In the 1920s, Virginia State established an annual alumni fund and created an alumni association with paid staff under the leadership of President John M. Gandy. At the same time, the innovation was spreading westward. In 1927, the president of the Ohio State Alumni Association encouraged the university president to launch an annual appeal while adverting to the alumni fund at the University of Michigan. The annual alumni fund thus proliferated throughout higher education. Meanwhile, the national multi-year fundraising drive run by paid staff arose in higher education. Women's colleges had initiated such efforts in 1910, as shown by Wellesley College President Ellen Pendleton here. Extending those initiatives, Harvard alumni launched the first full-fledged national drive in 1915. This famous Harvard Endowment Fund campaign was reported and publicized by newspapers across the country. The campaign adopted Eliot's quotation about free money as its motto and disseminated Eliot's free money strategy across the country. The annual alumni fund drive, invented in the 1890s, and the national multi-year fundraising drive, introduced in the 1910s, supplemented the traditional third mode of fundraising, which was to appeal quietly and discreetly to wealthy donors. The HBCUs at the time found this third mode more successful than the new widespread public appeals to white America. Often, these HBCUs formed musical groups that toured the country, seeking support for their schools from wealthy donors. This slide shows the Fisk University Jubilee Singers in England on their way to Windsor Castle for a private audience with the King and Queen to sing and seek funding for Fisk. Together, these three modes created the fundraising triad that became widely adopted by 1930 and that has persisted subsequently in higher education. During the interim period of the 1930s and 1940s, fundraising in the three modes naturally abated. Then in the 1950s and 1960s, fundraising resumed as the American economy grew rapidly and the gross domestic product doubled in size. This prosperity during these two decades fueled the first of the so-called golden ages of American higher education. Revenue poured in from several sources. First, students and families had more money to spend on college, and the average annual tuition income at nonprofit colleges and universities about doubled in constant dollars. Second, state governments had more tax revenue, and their annual appropriations for higher education also nearly doubled in constant dollars. Third, mammoth federal grants and contracts flooded into higher education for the first time. But those three sources were unreliable, as Charles Eliot had warned, unreliable in the long run, and they did not contribute to building endowments in higher education. The increase of invested capital during the 1950s and 1960s came from two other sources. On the one hand, fundraising in the three modes expanded. For example, the United Negro College Fund initiated national campaigns. Overall, annual donations to higher education increased by 150% during the 1950s and 1960s. On the other hand, endowments increased due to the soaring stock market and to novel approaches to investment strategy, which became known as portfolio management. During the 1800s and first half of the 1900s, portfolio management of higher education endowment was very conservative. Endowments were invested primarily in fixed income securities, such as bonds and mortgages. Stocks or equities constituted at most 15% of endowment portfolios. In 1951, the treasurer of Harvard University introduced a new aggressive approach to portfolio management, which came to be known as the 60-40 rule, investing 60% in stocks and 40% in fixed income securities. This now common approach for even personal portfolios was considered radical and risky in the 1950s. Only a few of the wealthiest colleges and universities dared to assume the risk and adopt it. Their large endowments then grew at a faster rate during the 1950s and 1960s. The 1970s brought a decade of stagflation, that is, stagnant growth and steep inflation. Nevertheless, starting in 1970, the Ford Foundation promoted an even more aggressive approach to portfolio management, which came to be known as total return. Whereas the 60-40 rule had involved investing equities primarily in blue chip stocks, this new approach encouraged investment in small companies and foreign companies that had larger capacity for growth and return on investment. Here again, only well-endowed schools adopted this riskier total return investing, while less endowed schools and most public and land-grant universities refrained. The third development in aggressive portfolio management came in the 1990s, when so-called alternative assets were introduced by Yale University. This extremely aggressive approach involved investing in hedge funds, private equity, and natural resources. Once again, only a few of the wealthiest schools initially invested in these volatile alternative assets, while less endowed schools, state universities, and land-grant universities refrained. This slide reveals the slow but steady adoption of investing in alternative assets over the past 30 years. Overall, the three innovations in portfolio management yielded unprecedented returns of endowment income. The annual returns on endowments often rode a frightening roller coaster of volatility due to the aggressive investment strategies, as shown on this slide of average returns between 1980 and 2007. Nevertheless, the returns for schools that could weather the volatility were extraordinary. Over the 4 decades between 1974 and 2014, the mean of the average annual return of all endowments was nearly 12%, and much, much higher for the wealthiest endowments. This was the best 40 years of portfolio performance in the history of American higher education up to that point. It was yet another golden age. These three innovations in portfolio management therefore combined with the fundraising triad to form 6 modes of building wealth that became conventional over the 20th century. The downside of this financial success was that nonprofit higher education became increasingly stratified by wealth. By the year 2020, just 1/5 of the nonprofit colleges and universities owned nearly 99% of endowment in higher education. The wealthiest 3% owned 80% of the endowment. And the richest 1%, which include Ohio State University, by the way, owned more than half. During the preceding 120 years, this stunning wealth gap and persistent lead of the richest schools developed due to what Sarah and I call the wealth advantages of the rich colleges and universities. The first advantage was simply that wealthy schools began to have more wealthy alumni who make large gifts and bequests. In the early 21st century, each additional increment of $100 million of endowment is associated with an additional $2 million in annual donations. Second, compounding that advantage, wealthy schools spent less per dollar raised than do less endowed schools. Third, wealthy schools had greater access to financial expertise because their trustees had ties to leading financiers, as scholars observed already in the 1920s. Fourth, rich schools could afford to hire those financiers and portfolio managers who achieve higher returns, but also charge high commissions. Fifth, only the schools with large endowments could afford the risk or volatility of investing in the new aggressive portfolio strategies after 1950, which yielded the highest returns. Sixth, although the wealthiest schools assumed great risk to reap the highest returns, they maintained conservative rules that limited the spending of their endowment income. The residual unspent income from their endowment was plowed back into their invested capital, which grew faster as a result. This low spending rate is a critical reason why the largest endowments grow faster than smaller endowments. Finally, if the wealthy schools stumbled, they could issue low-cost bonds to cover current obligations until their risky investments recovered. Like the $2.5 billion in bonds that Harvard issued during the Great Recession of 2008 and 2009 to cover its deflated assets. Less endowed schools, particularly HBCUs, found it harder to issue such bonds and paid more in underwriting fees to do so. Here was another reason why less endowed schools could not afford the risk to invest aggressively. All these factors constitute the wealth advantages of the richest schools, we argue. I will return to this point, but now I will address production cost. During the formative era, the US economy grew faster than ever before, and the gross national product rose more than 700% in constant dollars, as seen in the bottom red row of this table. Over the same period, the aggregate production operating cost of higher education grew more than 4,000% in constant dollars. And the aggregate capital of higher education, including endowment and all property, grew almost 2,000%. These increases in aggregate cost are astonishing. They mean that the aggregate cost of higher education escalated much, much faster than the national income during a period of unprecedented economic growth. Thus, the United States made a stupendous investment in higher education during the formative period. Such growth in the aggregate cost of higher education is usually salutary for the nation. A democratic society benefits when more people are educated at a higher level. Furthermore, increasing people's intellectual capital makes them more productive and generates more wealth for society as a whole. However, a serious problem may arise if the aggregate cost of higher education grows faster than the economy or the cost of living, as happened during the formative period. This trend is called cost escalation and means that higher education is consuming an increasing fraction of the national income, as is the case with healthcare today. Nevertheless, aggregate cost escalation may be justified if enrollment is expanding, because educating more students costs more money. Therefore, per student cost is the critical issue that economists, sociologists, and other scholars have focused on. But per student cost is hard to measure across higher education for a number of reasons. Nevertheless, our study of the formative era found that the per student production cost did not escalate. As you can see in the bottom red row of this table, that cost rose 27%, which was little more than the 17% rise in the price of commodities, all in constant dollars. Meanwhile, the first blue row of the table shows that in 1875, a year of college consumed the per capita national income of more than 3 people. And the bottom red row of this table shows that in 1930, a year of college consumed the per capita national income of about 1 person. Between 1875 and 1930, higher education therefore became about 3 times cheaper to produce for each student relative to per capita national income. So why did per student production costs become relatively cheaper, given that aggregate cost increased so much? As already suggested, the fundamental reason was that the number of students exploded. Between 1875 and 1930, the total number of colleges and universities more than doubled, and the number of their regular students rose over 13 times. During the next 2 decades of the 1930s and 1940s, per student production cost significantly declined, as seen in this slide. It was in the 1950s and 1960s that per student production cost began to rise steeply. In this first golden age, tuition income, state appropriations, and federal grants and contracts increased dramatically. And this additional revenue fueled the increased spending per student. As a result, during this first golden age, both the aggregate cost and per student cost of higher education increased much faster than the national income or the cost of living. During the 1960s, this dramatic cost escalation prompted many scholars to consider the alarming trend. The most influential study appeared in 1968, when William Bowen, an economist at Princeton, published what came to be considered the orthodox interpretation of historical per-student production cost. William Bowen, who later became the president of Princeton and the Mellon Foundation, relied on the elegant economic theory of cost disease. The scope of this lecture does not permit me to unpack the cost disease analysis of William Bowen, as Sarah and I do in our book. But it is important to note that Bowen relied on incomplete data from 3 unrepresentative universities, and he focused narrowly on the production costs directly devoted to instruction. This graph presents his findings, which lead to his fundamental conclusions. William Bowen concluded that the per-student production cost of higher education had escalated since the start of the 20th century and even since the start of the Industrial Revolution. Furthermore, he concluded that cost escalation in higher education was, in his words, inexorable and unpreventable because it resulted from the intrinsic nature of the higher education industry. Finally, William Bowen effectively absolved higher education leaders of responsibility for its escalating production cost. A decade later, in 1980, another economist named Howard Bowen, no relation to William Bowen, proposed a different, often misunderstood theoretical explanation that also became famous. Howard Bowen, who was formerly the president of Grinnell College and the University of Iowa, examined the broad expenses of colleges and universities. His analysis, which we clarify and name the revenue cost theory, famously maintained that colleges and universities seek and spend all the revenue they can get. Thus, leaders in higher education act like leaders of all charitable, ecclesiastical, and social service organizations, Howard Bowen said. Altruistically, they believe that the needs of their organizations are infinite because additional revenue can always be put to good use. But intense competition for prestige and influence also drive the insatiable need, Howard Bowen said. Furthermore, colleges and universities, particularly the wealthiest, spend less and less of their additional revenue on instruction, maintained Howard Bowen. Much of this non-instructional spending reflects an administrative expense bias that increases the fraction of revenue spent on staff and administration as the total revenue grows. Directors, deans, vice presidents, and their assistants multiply. Overall, Howard Bowen's revenue cost theory placed responsibility for the rising production cost squarely on higher education leaders, in contrast to William Bowen's exculpatory cost disease analysis. In addition, Howard Bowen showed that financial data do not support the cost disease theory. Drawing on large data sets that William Bowen had not consulted, Howard Bowen showed that per-student production cost actually declined during the 1930s, 1940s, and 1970s. In addition, our own study of the formative era found that the per-student production cost held steady with the cost of living between 1875 and 1930, as stated earlier. Over the century, from 1875 to 1980, per-student cost escalation occurred only in the 2 decades of the golden age before William Bowen's 1968 study. Therefore, financial data do not support William Bowen's cost disease conclusion that higher education cost escalates inexorably and unpreventably. In any event, in the 1980s, per-student production cost began to escalate again, as it had during the 1950s and 1960s. In the 1980s, that cost rose about 2.5% annually above inflation, according to one study. Then in 1995, changes in accounting rules made it increasingly difficult to analyze production cost over time or between the public and private sectors of higher education. Nevertheless, it was clear that the per student production cost continued to escalate in the 1990s. Then in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, the per student production cost of public colleges and universities grew 73% in constant dollars, and the cost of private colleges and universities rose 28% in constant dollars. The question of how to explain this cost escalation, therefore, remains central. And a marked shift in scholars' analyses occurred concurrently, as our history reveals. During the 1980s and 1990s, most scholars of higher education finance endorsed William Bowen's exculpatory cost-disease theory and neglected Howard Bowen's revenue cost theory. Then in the late 1990s, a few economists, particularly David Brenneman, announced that Howard Bowen's view was a credible alternative. Over the first 2 decades of the 21st century, many scholars continued to invoke William Bowen's cost-disease theory deferentially, while they simultaneously neglected the theory in their actual analyses. At the same time, paradoxically, scholars increasingly adopted tenets of the revenue cost theory of Howard Bowen, whom they often did not cite. This paradox occurred in part because William Bowen's 1968 cost-disease study was not subjected to close scrutiny until 2016, when significant flaws were identified. Conversely, some economists did not consider Howard Bowen's view a legitimate theory because it attributed cost growth to the intentions and motivations of higher education leaders, which could not be tested empirically, it was said. Our history validates Howard Bowen's revenue cost theory by revealing the origin of this thinking in the free money strategy of Charles Eliot at Harvard in the late 19th century, and by explaining the historical proliferation of this strategy subsequently. Our history also reveals that the public attitude toward higher education shifted significantly after the 1970s. During the century from the 1870s to the 1970s, Eliot's free money strategy was highly beneficial, and higher education was highly esteemed, and its cost escalation was considered justified. In the 1970s, experts such as Martin Troe at Berkeley and David Reisman at Harvard considered American higher education to be the best in the world. But in the 1980s, the insatiable need for money ignited criticism, which has devolved into resentment over the last 4 decades. To understand this widespread shift in attitude, we must now turn to examine price and debt. As noted in the introduction, the cost that schools incur to produce education is distinct from the price that students pay for that education. And price is often misunderstood because the approach in business is usually taken for granted. In business, price is set by adding a markup to the production cost. But nonprofit higher education has never taken that approach. For the past 150 years, the price charged to or paid by students has covered less than half, and often merely a third of the production cost of higher education. The other 2/3 of the production cost has been paid by different kinds of subsidies. In addition, price is misunderstood because the subsidies vary across the level and sector of higher education and depend on economic, political, and social factors. Price thus has varied adventitiously and idiosyncratically, and production cost is the more determinate and fundamental issue that can be studied and explained. Nevertheless, it is clear that through most of the formative era, the price remained relatively low and steady. Tuition at public colleges and universities generally amounted to less than half of the annual earnings of an unskilled worker, or about a quarter of the earnings of a school teacher. One reason for the low and steady tuition was that public colleges and universities feared alienating state legislatures, which made appropriations reluctantly. At the same time, private schools hesitated to raise their price, partly due to a charitable impulse, but also in order to remain competitive with the relatively low prices in the public sector. For example, both Johns Hopkins and Stanford universities did not charge any tuition at all in the first decade after they were founded. Indeed, many public and private schools across the country did not raise their tuition at all during the entire 4 decades from 1875 to 1915. Then in the 1920s, tuition increased significantly. This was a new phenomenon that caused some controversy, but the increases were justified by high inflation to keep up with the cost of living. During the 1930s and 1940s, tuition held steady as colleges and universities simply tried to fill their seats until the benefits of the GI Bill kicked in. It was during the first golden age of the 1950s and 1960s that tuition began to escalate above the cost of living, but few complaints were heard due to widespread prosperity at the time. Then, during the stagflation of the 1970s, tuition started to become highly controversial because colleges and universities began to hike tuition and other fees dramatically. These tuition hikes were made in order to compensate for inflation in the school's production cost and for the declining value of their various subsidies. Meanwhile, middle-class incomes were actually growing faster than the price of attending college. Higher education was therefore seen as the victim, not the villain. Nevertheless, the 1970s initiated the controversy about tuition that has continued subsequently. And why did the tuition, that is price, keep rising steadily after 1980? The fundamental reason, we argue, lies in a turning point in the American economy during the 1970s. After a century of unprecedented, robust expansion, American economic growth started to slow during the 1970s and subsequently remained relatively sluggish except for brief periods. This slower growth led to rising prices, in part because government subsidies to higher education began to shrink proportionally after 1980. Due to this proportional decline in government subsidies, colleges and universities had to raise tuition and fees in order to cover the shortfall, particularly public colleges and universities, which were most impacted. The burden of paying the production cost at public schools therefore shifted from taxpayers to individual students during the last 4 decades, as many economists have observed. Meanwhile, the slowing economic growth also dragged on private colleges and universities, which had always engaged more intensely in the competition to increase their spending and wealth. Even so, the private schools had deliberately moderated tuition increases prior to 1970. Then the dramatic increases during the stagflation of the 1970s revealed something new. It seemed that the wealthiest elite private schools could charge virtually any price they wish. Whatever Princeton or Stanford name as tuition, there will be excellent students from families willing to pay it. And in order to compete, private schools with less prestige and resources were forced to raise their tuition. Thus, in higher education, it is widely understood that the wealthiest elite schools drive the tuition escalation. This creates an insidious problem for the less endowed and less elite private schools. The tuition published by colleges and universities is their list price, as seen in the middle column on this slide. Historically, through the 1960s, most students paid the entire relatively low list price from their savings, loans, or part-time work. Some students paid a lower price because they received funded grant aid, such as endowed scholarships or GI benefits, This funded grant aid reduced the amount that students had to pay. Their lower price is the net price paid by students, which is the list price minus the grant aid, as seen in the right-hand column of this slide. During the 1970s, most students still paid the list price, while some students paid a lower net price due to receiving grant aid. But another new factor emerged during the 1970s. In order to compete with wealthier schools, some less wealthy private colleges began to discount tuition by cutting their list price for certain students in order to encourage them to enroll. This reduction in list price for certain students was different than providing them with funded grant aid and had no precedent in higher education. Discounting meant reducing the tuition revenue received by the school, as seen in the third and fourth columns of this slide. Then, in the decades after 1980, tuition discounting accelerated rapidly at most private colleges and universities as they competed to recruit students. For these schools, the discounts meant lost revenue. However, the wealthiest elite schools did not have to discount because they could fund the entire difference between their list price and their net price with funded grant aid. Colleges and universities are naturally reluctant to divulge how much they discount, and the topic has been studied only recently. Less than a quarter of the private nonprofits report the amount they discount, while discounting at public institutions is murky and little studied or reported. Nevertheless, it is known that by 2009, undergraduates were paying only about 45% of the average list price at private colleges and universities, which do most of the discounting. Here arises another wealth advantage of the richest elite private schools. They drive the increases in list price, which are widely publicized and stoke public resentment. And they receive all the revenue for the list price they charge because they can afford to provide funded grant aid instead of discounts. Meanwhile, less endowed schools have been replicating the list price while receiving proportionally less and less revenue because they are supplying more and more discounts. Tuition discounting and the proportional shrinking of government subsidies have created a perfect storm for most of the 3,300 colleges and universities in recent decades. List price rose rapidly, which inflamed public anger, but the average net price paid by undergraduates remained level between 2006 and 2020. So net tuition revenue did not increase for most schools across higher education. Then came the monster wave of student debt, which grew to $1.6 trillion or more today. Why did student debt grow if the net price held steady? Federal policy on educational loans certainly facilitated and encouraged borrowing by students in general, as historian John Thalen has explained. But these policies do not explain why undergraduates chose to assume burdensome debt that they would struggle to repay. To address this question, it is important to distinguish the different kinds of students who owe debt. As seen in the top bar of this chart, about half of the debt is owed by graduate students, including those in medical, law, or business school. About another quarter of the debt is owed by undergraduates who attended often predatory for-profit colleges and universities. These students generally owe the largest amounts of debt, as seen in this table. They also have the highest default rates. In addition, it is important to distinguish students with debt in socioeconomic terms. This slide reveals that students with more debt come from the lower 3 quintiles of household income in the nation, especially the bottom 20%. In other words, students from middle class or working class families hold most of the debt, and their burdensome debt threatens the democratic benefits of higher education mentioned at the outset. Our focus is on undergraduates at nonprofit schools who owe burdensome debt. A major reason for this burdensome debt is neither the rising list price nor the net price, which has remained level over the past 14 years on average. Rather, students have to pay for ancillary expenses apart from tuition and academic fees. And these expenses, food, housing, travel, books, clothing, and so forth, have risen with the cost of living, which has grown faster than wages and salaries of middle class and working class families over the last 4 decades. In addition, this growing shortfall could not be covered by the students' colleges, because students with burdensome debt attended colleges that had fewer resources to assist their students. As a result, students had to borrow. In sum, we argue that undergraduates attending nonprofit schools assumed burdensome debt over the last 4 decades, not due to publicized hikes in the list price of tuition, but because ancillary expenses rose with the cost of living, and their household income of wages and salaries lagged behind the cost of living. And the schools they attended have little or no endowment, while the revenue of the public colleges has declined due to proportionally shrinking public subsidies, and the revenue of private colleges has declined proportionally due to tuition discounting. At this point, I will conclude with a few brief comments tying the issue of student debt back to wealth and revenue. First, our history shows that wealth stratification in higher education has persisted over the last 120 years and widened significantly since 1950, especially since 1980. Also, when schools reach the upper tiers, they generally maintain that position due to the wealth advantages enjoyed by those in the upper tiers. Second, the wealth stratification in higher education has exceeded and now parallels the wealth inequality in the nation. In the bottom row of this table, you can see that the percentages of wealth stratification and wealth inequality are now about equal. That is, the concentrations of wealth in each dimension. Third, we argue that this parallel in the bottom row exists because both the wealth stratification in higher education and the national wealth inequality derive from similar and interrelated wealth advantages. Above all, the most significant advantage is that income from aggressively invested capital increases faster than the cost of living and faster than salaries and wages of the working and middle classes. This advantage has increased during the past 40 years, while economic growth has slowed. Finally, we propose that the shared advantage contributes to burdensome debt for students whose households rely on wages and salaries that have little invested capital, and who attend colleges in the bottom 80% with little or no endowment. Let me restate this closing point because Sarah, Iler, and I have been misunderstood in this regard. We are not saying that the wealthiest schools cause burdensome debt for students. We are saying that undergraduates who lack the wealth advantage of invested capital and who attend schools in the bottom 80% without the advantage of invested capital have had to assume debt that they struggle to repay. Thank you very much. That concludes my lecture.
Thank you much, Professor Kimball. Jason, I'm going to ask you to help me identify persons who have questions for our speaker. Are there any questions?
Looks like we have one from S. and Katz. Oh, never mind.
I have a question. Kay Hubner, one of the people introduced in the beginning. I know it's a simple question, but it's not a simple answer. what do you see as the solution or a solution or contributing to a solution to this problem?
Well, actually, I have a naive suggestion solution that we suggest at the end of our book, which is that basically the wealthiest elite colleges and universities need to change their practices. In our view, in our historical analysis, they are driving the whole fleet in a certain direction. They're perseverating in economic and financial behavior that was highly beneficial for the first century, but has increasingly become counterproductive and created, engendered public resentment over the last 40 years. So we suggest, frankly, some kind of wealth sharing, not a redistribution of endowment, but an effort on their part to pick up other sectors of American higher education that are effectively left behind.
But they are, at least as I understand it, some of the wealthiest universities have actually eliminated tuition for many of the students. So they're using some of their wealth. Obviously, these are maybe not the students who need the support, but they are supporting the education in greater largesse, it seems, recently. But
yeah, they aren't eliminating tuition. They're eliminating loans. Essentially, they're providing more financial aid for their own students. We would suggest that this is still keeping the wealth within their own institutions. And so what's called for is more extending aid to other sectors of higher education in various kind of ways. The students, what comes through, I think, in the debt question is students from the wealthiest institutions are not struggling with student debt. They may have some debt, but they are not struggling with burdensome debt that they can't repay. It's the students in the lower unendowed sectors of higher education that are struggling. So that's just purely on the student debt issue. But also, I mean, I think this under the 2017 Republican Tax and Jobs Creation Act, where was the first time that higher education endowments were taxed. There was a kind of a punitive excise tax. You've probably heard. I'm sure many people have heard about it. I mean, that was kind of the canary in the coal mine, which is not something I would support, but it expresses a degree of public resentment. Now, there was you could argue it in political terms, partisan terms, but that was unimaginable for 150 years. That excise tax on endowments of the crown jewels of American higher education was unimaginable for 150 years. So there had to be some popular and political shift in view toward higher education to support that, which we are, document in the book. So that's kind of an example of the crown jewels of American higher education are under attack. And it's because they're perseverating in this financial behavior, in our view.
Are their endowments tax-free?
Well, yes, their endowments have been tax-free in the past.
So maybe that's part of the problem.
Well, that's the whole point of the Tax and Jobs Act of 2017. I guess you have to believe that the federal government will do better with the wealth than Harvard would do with it, or Princeton or whatnot. I'm kind of skeptical about that. I'm saying that these leading wealthiest elite institutions still have it within their capacity to change the financial paradigm of higher education. They created it 150 years ago, and they have it within their capacity to change the financial paradigm today. and reverse the evident trend toward criticism and resentment in higher education. But they're perseverating in the same kind of behavior that was practiced for 150 years. I mean, in a sense, I'm sorry, I won't go on. I get exercise. But see, this financial strategy, what we call this free money strategy, has become the kind of common sense. It's right, like you have to have an annual alumni fund, right? As soon as a national fundraising drive ends, you have to start another one. I mean, that's what leaders of higher education feel they have to do. Learn what they have to do. And it's those kind of practices, along with the question of sharing the wealth, you might say. Moving from the competitive ethos that has prevailed. That's something, Ramspec?
Yes. What about public policy solutions?
Well, I suppose they're, I should say first that what we've done is basically tried to analyze this historically, explain what's going on. And so Sarah and I have not sort of thought through thoroughly. We're not advocating particular kinds of solutions. So I feel a little bit out of my depth here. I'm not sure. Yeah, public policy solutions there might be some out there. Although, I have to say, I mean, David Reisman at Harvard was my mentor there. And he always argued that one of the greatest strengths of higher education was, as did Martin Troy at Berkeley, was the diversity of kinds of institutions. And in particular, a strong private sector that was where colleges and universities had autonomy to figure out new solutions to problems, rather than having it be all dictated by a central education agency, as in Japan or say in Germany. So I guess there might be some public policy solutions, but I would not want I myself would not feel comfortable with the guiding hand of the federal government or reorganizing higher education.
There's another question by Marguerite Thomason. What impact could loan forgiveness have?
Well, I think loan forgiveness is very justified, particularly for the undergraduates in the nonprofit sector. As I indicated in the lecture, it seems to me the graduate students who owe half of the debt, it's a very different kind of problem, if you will, to consider loan forgiveness. And the private schools sector, which A.J. Angiulo has studied very carefully, is a real hornet's nest, because a lot of the private schools, private for-profit schools, I misspoke. I'm talking about the debt of for-profit schools. About a quarter of the debt is held by students who attended for-profit schools, and many of those schools close down, which they often do in difficult economic times. So essentially, where'd the money go? The money went to the proprietors of the for-profit schools. So I think that loan forgiveness is very justified particularly for the undergraduates who attended nonprofit schools. Yeah. Mark DeBard.
First, thanks for a very logical, clear, and well-given talk. It was brilliant. Second of all, the endowments for Ohio State and Michigan are listed. Obviously, two of the wealthier public colleges. If you stuck them on the list of private nonprofit colleges, we'd be 20th for Ohio State and 8th for Michigan. And I note Michigan's got 3 times the endowment of Ohio State. How did that situation arise? Do we know?
I have to laugh because actually Benjamin Johnson, one of my Ph.D. students, tried to study that exact issue for his dissertation, and it got very murky. Basically, one of the important reasons was two important reasons come to mind. One is Michigan started earlier. Ohio State we built a football stadium. Ohio State built a football stadium in the 1910s or 1920s. And I think Michigan sort of started developing its endowment much earlier. And starting earlier gives you a lead up. Secondly, the University of Michigan has a special constitutional status because it was actually it's established in the state constitution of the state of Michigan. And so its trustees have kind of a special sphere of autonomy within public entities in the United States. So I think over time that autonomy for the University of Michigan allowed it to be more entrepreneurial than Ohio State did. Then was permitted Ohio State, which was founded by the state and had to answer to the state legislature longer.
Thanks.
Also, I should say too, a third factor actually, because this is very interesting, is, Ohio State, of course, is a land-grant institution. The University of Michigan is not a land-grant institution. And so land-grant institutions have historically extolled their egalitarian ethos and access to all members of of society. So Ohio State, up until really the 1980s, had kept very low admission standards for undergraduates because it was sort of open to everyone. So Ohio State got later into the game of being a sort of competitive flagship public university than did the University of Michigan.
Okay, you have
Patty Lather?
a few questions now.
Oh, okay. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
To get back to the topic of free money, how free are endowments now?
That's interesting because most when there are difficult economic times and there's budget crunches, students and faculty will often go to the presidents or leaders and
you want to go now, mommy?
What?
Sure, let's go.
Okay. Students will often say, why don't you spend some money in the endowment? And presidents will say, well, the endowment is all committed to certain, it's restricted in certain ways. So most of the endowment, I would hazard the guess, of most colleges and universities is in fact restricted in various ways. But one of the things I omitted because I had to truncate my explanation was that Elliott, this free money strategy, argued that many kinds of restricted endowments were actually fungible. In other words, all money is green, and you can pay for if a wise and astute college president can move the money around to sort of turn restricted endowments into virtually unrestricted endowments through their fungibility. So how free are endowments now? I guess the answer I'd say, I think they're freer than your university president will often tell you, or university presidents will often say, because they don't want to, they don't want to have to give it up. Maybe that's the best way to answer it.
Thank you.
Another question from Beth Sutton Remspec. More funding from states for state-funded institution, ? Increase in federal grants, ?
Could you elaborate on that, Beth? You're just asking, is Beth still here?
Yeah, sorry. I was just asking, in terms of potential public policy solutions, since you mentioned that I'm in English. I'm not good with numbers, but you mentioned that that the amount of money that states were spending for covering education has gone down, and someone else in their questions had a specific figure on that, just a little further down from mine. If one of the solutions to the problem of higher costs for students would be if states were to invest more in public education, and if the federal government were to provide more government grants than they currently do.
Well, yes, that would make a huge difference. And just looking down, Ardeen Nelson has some figures there below which seem to fit precisely with this kind of shift that I'm talking about. You know, it's important now. The word proportional is important, and you can see Ardeen talks about percentages there, because the tricky thing is the aggregate amount of state appropriations to higher education actually increased in constant dollars, but the proportion of their costs that those increased dollars paid actually declined. Okay, so that's one sort of concession to the other side, you might say. But in addition, the 1980s, and I wanted to stay away from sort of partisan politics issue. Of course, with 1980s, the president was Ronald Reagan, and who came in with the idea that the government is the problem, not the solution. And you may recall his budget director was David Stockman, who very famously said that there's opportunity enough for students to get a higher education if they want to, and it shouldn't be funded by the taxpayers' dollars. So there was a definite public policy shift or political shift in subsidizing higher education from the public purse, from taxpayers, and that certainly increased. That certainly contributed to the decline that Ardeen talks about, which is a good example of the overall shift that I had on the slide there as well. Nevertheless, it's also the case, I mean, apart from the political spectrum or lens you might take, it's also a case that this slowing economic growth was critical, because if economic growth had continued as it had between the 1870s and 1970, if there's lots of money, prosperity, growing economy, there's a lot more capacity to support all kinds of public endeavors. So, the problem is getting more funding for the states, as Beth says. That would certainly help a lot, but you can see the questions already arising about the loan forgiveness program and the opposition to that. So there's a resistance to that, and I would connect that resistance to the resentment and criticism that I talked about in the lecture, which again is driven, in our view, by the practices of the wealthiest elite colleges and universities.
You can see another question.
Oh yes, so Bruce Blaine.
Yeah, about online learning.
To quote one of my favorite Monty Python skits, "G'day, Bruce."
Hi.
It's Bruce. I'm just curious as to how this sort of shift from a traditional on-campus plant-based university versus an online environment where perhaps the debts are not as great, but maybe the degree is not viewed as being the same level of quality. How do you think that's going to?
Well, yes, that's very interesting. Actually, the rise of online learning was one of the things invoked by supporters of the cost disease theory, as a way to cure the cross disease. Now, I didn't unpack that in the lecture, but in a thumbnail, basically, the cost disease theory argues that increasing production cost in higher education is driven by faculty salaries.
Right.
That's sort of in a thumbnail. The faculty salaries, the increasing faculty salaries are the problem, if you will. Not that individual faculty members are making more money, but that the productivity of faculty does not increase. So the solution was, that's often been talked about over decades, was this online learning in that context, but also more in general. So I think that might, I think that will radically change the financing. But here's the rub, it seems to me. Based on what I've read, there's a consensus among the wealthiest elite colleges, which I subscribe to, that in-person education is much better. In-person education in small classes with low student faculty ratios is much preferable to online learning. So
I could go on for about 2 hours with you, how much I hate online.
Yeah. Okay. Well, so the question is, you could see a bifurcation of higher education.
Right.
And not according to cost, but also online would be serving those institutions that are less endowed, and so forth. Thank you, Bruce. Let me go on to this next one. Julie.
Yes.
What?
Sorry about that.
No problem.
Yeah, where did my question go?
How does the per student cost account?
Oh yeah, how does the per student cost account for shifts in how does the shift in percentages of undergrad versus grad students account for the per student cost shift? So schools are enrolling more graduate students who cost more, right?
Right.
What impact does that have on your numbers?
Well, much of the numbers that I cite from the 20th century here are from Howard Bowen's study in 1980. And that is for the first 3/4 of the 20th century. And he calibrated the difference in cost between undergraduates and graduate students. So he came up with his own measure, and other economists have tried to do that. But as you astutely observe, it's a swamp. Okay, it's a swamp. In the formative era that we talk about, graduate students are a very small percentage, so it's not so germane there. But you're right with the. So all I can say is when the costs I gave for per student were factored based on analysis of graduate and undergraduate. But the more recent ones I cited about the beginning of the 21st century, okay, those were purely undergraduates. Those Sarah Iler computed fairly recently based on national NCES data.
Okay.
So those were undergraduates that I just cited. Now let me see. I see Gideon Frankel.
What is it that you say?
Oh, Gideon Frankel is waving, but I have one more question. If you could just let me just wait, Gideon. Marguerite Thomason.
Yeah.
Yes, I had wondered about our changes in demographics. Say the baby boomer job market is coming to retirement age. Our children are a much smaller demographic than we were. And I wonder if the supply and demand will increase both opportunity for actually using your areas of specialization in your work choice and hiring outcomes, as well as your salaries? And could that potentially enable more repayment of these debts? Or is inflation going to mitigate or eliminate any chance that these new opportunities based on our demographics might provide?
Well, there's a lot there in that question. Let me talk first about the demographic trend and the baby boomers, because there's recently been written a lot about the coming precipice over which higher education is going because of the declining college age population, just in general. That is something higher education isn't prepared for, because there's not going to be enough students to fill all the seats in higher education as the babies of the baby boomers of the babies of the baby boomers decline. So that demographic trend is huge, and something higher education will have to struggle with. The second point is, I would say, the prospect of debt, all that we're seeing nationally, is scaring off a lot of people from going to higher education. They're looking into whether they're going to get a return on attending higher education. I've just anecdotally, I have a lot of friends and colleagues, as I'm sure you do, who are surprising me, who had very big careers, went to universities, and they're questioning themselves whether they would advise someone to go to college anymore. Become a plumber instead, or an electrician. So the combination, what I'm saying about this decline of student enrollment with the questioning about questioning the cost effectiveness of attending college, the return on a college education, is quite alarming, and I think really going to influence our enrollments. Now, you ask about the labor markets and whether I don't know whether they can. I guess whether these graduates will be able to go into specialties that can repay their loans. I really can't speculate about that, but I think actually to get students to attend, to fill the seats of higher education, borrowing is going to have to decrease, because the supply of students is simply going to shrink a great deal. Now, actually, Gideon, did you have something you wanted to say? Let me just, because Gideon was here. I can't hear what you're saying. Jason? Okay.
I just asked him to unmute.
Oh, I see. Okay.
And you'll have to unmute yourself. In the bottom left, there should be a button that looks like a microphone. Yeah, you're still muted, Gideon.
Okay, let me turn to Let me just turn to this other question that's just come up about from Julie Carpenter-Hubin from a Data Geek. Faculty salaries have not increased at nearly the rate of administrative salaries. Shh. You could get us into trouble here, right? But yes, that is well documented, particularly about president's salaries. And there's a story to that. Part of the story is that trustees, and I've heard this, talk this to presidents and trustees, trustees of college and universities increasingly come from major corporations and are CEOs in major corporations, and they tend to evaluate the compensation of the president of the university in line with what they should be making as a CEO of a major corporation. That is a huge impact on the rising compensation of presidents. And there are studies about the rising compensation of presidents And so your comment, this OSU that you say here, this is that's simply an example of a widespread trend among presidential salaries. But also, hey, have you looked at your your law firm lately? I mean, the legal staff on higher education, not you, TK, but the university legal staffs have grown tremendously. This is part of what Howard Bowen was talking about. You know, I know just a little data, one example. I mean, in 1980, Boston University had, I think, 2 lawyers on staff. And in the early 21st century, they had 25 lawyers on staff. Boston University did. Well, think how much it costs to maintain a legal staff of 25 lawyers and their assistants. You know, but that's an example of growth administration. Gideon.
Yes. Okay.
I think according to this, I am unmuted.
Yes.
You are.
Okay, all right. I just wanted to bring up 2 things. I'm not an economist, but I was on the fiscal committee of the Senate for many, many years, and we talked about these things. And the first thing that made an impression on me was when I was an undergraduate at the University of Illinois, tuition cost $60 a semester. And for many years, you could work your way through college. And the difference was, of course, subsidy from state government and taxes and things like that. The students we have at Ohio State don't come from the lower echelons of society in general. They come from places where they can afford to go to college. Here, this seems to be a universal problem. It is not apparently a universal problem in Western Europe. It costs a lot less. It costs a lot less in Canada. The second thing is, has also been alluded to other people, and that is the relative cost of administration at Ohio State increased enormously. We documented it. We showed pie charts. They made all sorts of excuses for why they needed more administrators. But the point is, those people had their hands on the money, so they obviously supported themselves rather than us. Well, that's more or less what I had to tell you. Thank you for listening.
I wonder, you said it costs a lot less in Canada and Western Europe.
Yes.
The question partly is how you're using cost. I assume you're using cost in terms of the price paid by the students.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
Right.
I have a nephew who graduated from McGill, and this is why I know this. And right. I have friends whose children went in Britain, in Canada, France, Germany, and so on. And there they find the money publicly. I mean, it can be done. There just doesn't seem to be a will here anymore.
No, I agree with what you're saying. I'm just saying it's a question of public subsidy.
Yes, absolutely.
Because the price, what you're talking about, is the price that students pay.
Yes.
It's not the production cost is less, it's that the subsidies are much higher.
Quite so, yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very interesting talk, by the way.
Thank you.
Well, group, it's 5:30. Unless you want to go on, Bruce.
I'm happy to go on if others, if anyone wishes to. I don't want to keep anyone who doesn't want to. You can just.
I don't see any more questions in the chat.
Okay, well then I guess we should excuse everyone.
But are there any other questions that are not in the chat? Hearing none. What a fabulous presentation, Bruce. Wonderful to have you again. I'd like to have you back.
Yes, Bruce, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you, Mr. Daniel. Thank you all for attending.
Okay.
Okay.
All right.
Good night.
Thanks, everybody.